So, hello everyone. I'm Sara Brumfield with FromThePage.
And I'm Ben.
This is my partner Ben, and we're thrilled that you're here today to join us to learn a little bit about what we've learned over the last decade and a half, really, of running crowdsourcing projects. Next slide. We'll send out a recording of this and a list of all the resources that we mention as we go along. Probably in a day or two by Monday. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about what is FromThePage, which is our crowdsourcing platform. A lot of the advice we bring to the table today applies to a lot of other types of crowdsourcing tasks and platforms as well, though. What is effective crowdsourcing, because we want it to work, right? Thinking about volunteers, selecting material, developing your transcription conventions, kicking off projects, and then keeping your volunteers engaged in the longer run. And then at the end, we'll take Q&A and we'll have an optional demo of how FromThePage works.
Okay, so let's get started. So Sarah and I, as she mentioned, we run a platform for crowdsourcing tasks around archival documents. Generally, that's manuscript transcription, OCR correction, translation, indexing, and that's kind of given us a view. We've hosted projects for a number of institutions for, since 2010, I think. So we've been able to watch kind of what's worked and what hasn't, as well as being in conversation with other practitioners in the field. So our goal today is to pass along kind of the soft skills involved in running successful crowdsourcing projects. And we think that a lot of them have applicability, as Sarah said, to other kinds of tasks that might be photo identification or things that aren't specific to archival documents as well. So in brief, our platform allows people to see the image of a page and gives them a place to transcribe the text from the page. So we try to keep that bit of software as simple as possible because transcribing handwritten documents is hard enough. So we've seen a lot of successful projects over the years. Here's just a handful of the institutions that we've partnered with. And with all of them, what we try to see and what we try to learn from is how to run effective crowdsourcing. So what is effective crowdsourcing? We see effective crowdsourcing as a collaboration between a memory institution and the public, with the goals being deep public engagement with special collections and archives to enhance metadata. So when I say deep engagement, let me kind of explain that a little bit more. So nowadays, a lot of organizations have social media presences, Instagram accounts, things like that. That lets them expose their materials a lot more broadly to the public. And that's great for broad engagements. But one of the challenges is that the interactions they have with the public are mostly just people clicking a like button. Occasionally you'll get a comment or a share. So you get a lot of breadth, but you don't get a lot of depth. You don't have people being able to immerse themselves in your material, share their own passion, their own knowledge and experience with you about it. It's really kind of a passive experience as opposed to a collaboration. So in addition to being about public engagement, crowdsourcing is also about improving metadata for digitized collections in ways that require what I think of as kind of massive amounts of human interpretation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean massive numbers of volunteers or massive amounts of data, but it's the kind of human-focused task that institutions generally just don't have the staff for. They don't have the priorities, right? You're looking for possibly one person who's really passionate about transcribing a single set of letters or a single diary, which is generally not within the remit of staff at these organizations.
So this is a great example. This is from the Chicago Botanic Garden. And if you look, there's not a lot of text on these pages, but what it takes to provide that interpretation is knowledge of orchidology, which I don't have, and a lot of people don't have. The captions are in German, but they have a lot of Latin because these are botanic terms. And they're actually really fun because you get to look at, sketches of the flowers. So massive amount of interpretation, but done by one volunteer who's passionate about the topic and has the particular skill set that you're looking for.
Just on one or two sets of these orchidology notebooks too.
But really unique materials that
Right.
they're holding and that are now much more accessible.
So speaking of archival and library staff, effective crowdsourcing is really only possible with the guidance and engagement of archive staff. One of the things we try to tell administrators and management is that you cannot replace staff members and trained information professionals with the crowd, right? That it just doesn't work.
So we have a picture of a cute puppy here because our standing joke is that crowdsourcing is not free as in speech or free as in beer, but free as in puppy. The puppy's free, but you have to take care of it. You have to do a lot of work. The volunteers that are participating in these projects don't like being ignored. They don't like having their work lost. They're doing something that they feel is meaningful and they're engaging with you and your institution. And they're kind of, therefore, you've got to make sure that their work is meaningful and engage with them. So we're going to talk a lot about the work that goes into successful crowdsourcing projects. So let's start with volunteers, because if you don't have volunteers, you aren't going to have a successful crowdsourcing project. This is a picture of some of the Library of Virginia's volunteers. It's at their annual Transcribiversary. LVA has this really robust crowdsourcing program. But I love how diverse their volunteers are. We know that crowdsourcing volunteers tend to skew older. Retirees love these projects, but LVA actually has a lot of students that work with them as well. So you need to start by thinking, where can we find volunteers? Who will they be? Do you already have volunteers that work with your institutions? Do you have people who are local who are interested? Maybe you have local material that your local history societies or your local genealogists would be interested in working with. Maybe you're deep on a particular subject matter and you can reach out to communities around that subject matter. So one of our very early projects was with the Yaquina Head lighthouses. They had lighthouse keepers logs over decades, and they were able to engage with lighthouse fans. It turns out there are people who are really enthusiastic about lighthouses, and to have those people virtually come in and work on transcribing was a good match. Next slide. When you think about volunteers, you could also think about what material has been most popular with your patrons and why it's popular. So this image is a volunteer with the Missouri State Archives, and she's holding her grandfather's birth certificate. Genealogists love projects with lots of names and vital information, even if the material is not as engaging as diaries or letters. The other thing to realize is that crowdsourcing is not something you are familiar with, probably, but it's also something that your volunteers will probably not be familiar with. It's a bit intimidating to do something new, right? So if you think through how you can make it easier for them, that puts you in a good mindset for working with your volunteers. When you run projects on FromThePage, we actually have a cadre of about 5,000 active volunteers who work on projects on our platform. And we send out a monthly newsletter to those of them that have opted in, and that features new projects or projects that perhaps need some more attention. And if you want us to include you, you just reach out and we can. And what we see is that volunteers and transcribers get very into this type of work. It's really fun. It's very engaging. It's what we call meaningful work, which is kind of one of our core values, both for what we do, what our volunteers do, and hopefully what you are doing with us, so partnering with both of us. The image on the screen represents the most active transcribers on 3 different projects. The Indiana Archives, the Library of Virginia, and the California State Archives all did World War I related projects in kind of overlapping time periods. And what you see here is that while the bulk of their active transcribers were kind of independent, just worked on their project, there were overlaps. There are definitely volunteers who go from project to project. A lot of our focus actually this year is looking for ways to connect volunteers to their next project, newer projects that might overlap with interests that they've expressed in the past by working on other projects. We actually have one volunteer who about once a month will scroll through our list of projects looking for something she hasn't worked on, and she'll go hop in and try something new. It's fascinating. Sometimes
She's worked on every single project on the site, I believe.
you know, sometimes she finds something that she's really interested in and she goes deep and contributes a lot, which is really valuable because she's very experienced and puts in a lot of energy and time. And sometimes she does a page or two and moves on if she's not interested in whatever the material is. So volunteers, they're important.
So let's talk about what kind of material attracts interest. We've got to say, let me start with a caveat. Success comes in many forms, and volunteers are motivated by a number of different kinds of things. Not every volunteer is motivated by the same thing, just like not everyone is interested in the same stuff. So the things that we tend to look for is material that can tell good stories, by which we mean that if you start reading it, you really want to turn the page and find out what happens next. So letters and diaries are fantastic for this. Because they have that kind of narrative momentum, right? You really do want to know what happens next. You've got this immersive experience that people get from transcribing them and doing this kind of deep reading that comes from transcribing the text. But not everything that's immersive necessarily needs to be a narrative text like a diary. We've seen immersive experiences from World War I service records in which the user who's transcribing a card for each soldier, sailor, nurse who served in a particular county and from Alabama in World War I is kind of immersed back in that community, right? They see names that they're familiar with. They see names that are repeated and realize, oh, these must be cousins. These must be family members, right? And there's no narrative there at all. There's no continuity other than the material itself. It's still very immersive. You can also be successful with material that has a lot of local history or a lot of family history. Indianapolis Public Library ran a project transcribing records from Indianapolis public schools. And I've got to say, these are super boring. There are a list of each student and when they enrolled and who their parents are and when they moved in from, or if they're leaving, where they're going to. It is dry reading, but it is a genealogist's gold mine or a local historian's gold mine to see who these people were and what their connections are.
Yeah, those genealogists have benefited from a lot of this type of work done by other people, and they recognize that. And so they're willing to kind of give back to the greater knowledge pool about individuals by doing this type of work because they understand its importance.
Yeah.
We find that if you can give volunteers a sense of accomplishment, that's very motivating. So I think many of us are motivated by checking things off the list. So some of the World War I projects I was talking about earlier two of them were World War I service card projects, and they were both really successful. And I think it was that you had single cards. And so example, the Alabama Department of Archives and History was the first one to do this. They had a single card. They only collected about 5 fields from each card. So a transcriber could get a lot done, right? We all like to get stuff done. That feeling of accomplishment kept them coming back. That particular project was 111,000 World War I service cards, and they transcribed them all in 2.5 months. Because their material hit so many of these points, right, gave people a sense of accomplishment. They contained a lot of local history. The details fleshed out the story of World War I in your county. And because they had great relationships with their local genealogy and history organizations, and they actually matched up card sets by county, so it really was very local. They managed to get through those 111,000 cards in 2.5 months, which surprised all of us. It was very successful.
So after you've selected material, the next thing to do is to come up with instructions for your crowdsourcing task. For our transcription project, we call this transcription conventions. And it's really important to have these and to have them be informed by your own experience or your volunteer's experience trying to deal with the text. Because here's the thing, not everyone is going to read a manual of instructions. In fact, very few people will. But the minute that a volunteer encounters words that are hard to read, or maybe they have irregular spelling or outdated terminology, they're going to have questions and they're going to ask for help. So we encourage projects to develop these conventions in advance. We actually show them on the transcription screen themselves, as well as on a separate help page. And we recommend that when you're developing them, you do a few pages yourself, right? Go through the, you may think you know what's in your documents, but as you try to transcribe them, you're going to have questions about what do you do about line breaks, or what do you do about these terms, or hey, there's this pencil sketch here, what do I do about those? And document those decisions, document those problems in your conventions. The next step is to bring someone else in, right? Grab someone from down the hallway, get a friend online on a Zoom session and let them share their screen and transcribe these. Listen to the questions that they have and your responses, and document those, right? This is a great way to improve your transcription conventions. And then you can keep improving them as projects run on, as end users ask questions, or as you discover people doing things you don't quite like and you wish they do a little differently. You can add to these.
We actually recommend that you, maybe your sample pages that you were working through to develop your transcription conventions, to kind of peel those off and make them examples, because people will often not read directions, but they will go look at how other things were done. So if you have some clearly marked examples, and maybe you link to them in your transcription conventions, they'll go poke around those to kind of see what you did and how you did it.
And I should have mentioned that these particular conventions are from the Wisconsin Historical Society, who do a great job on their documentation. So we mentioned bringing people together to work on transcribing pages while you're developing your instructions. You can kind of kick that up a notch and host transcribe-a-thons. They are a great way to launch your project. Library of Virginia does 2 transcribe-a-thons every month, one in person and one online. You don't have to do that. You could just do one at the very beginning of your project.
Or none.
Yes.
It is possible to do this without doing one,
but if you do one, you can bring in the people who you think might be leaders within the field, the subject matter, the leaders within their communities. So if you bring in people, when the Alabama World War I project, they brought in people who were active in their county historical societies or their local genealogy societies, and they gave them the opportunity in person to work through the experience of doing the crowdsourcing task, to get over the discomfort of, I'm not sure I can read this handwriting, or I'm not sure that, how this technology works, or more commonly, well, I'm not a librarian, I'm not an archivist, is my work good enough, right? And you can get them over that discomfort, get them the familiarity and the enthusiasm that they can then bring back to their own communities. Because often, they're busy, but they introduce it to someone else who becomes absolutely passionate, because this is exactly what they've been looking for a way to spend their time. They're also great publicity, right? And we've got a couple of examples picked out here. On the left, you see a Facebook post about a transcribe-a-thon at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, working on colonial French documents. And the interesting thing to me about this is that it's being promoted not by the Jazz Museum, but by the French department at Tulane. So completely different people are saying, hey, maybe if you're interested in French, you should go work on this. On the right-hand side, you see a live tweet by a participant in a transcribe-a-thon at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, saying, check it out, I'm learning how to read medieval Latin. Isn't this cool? You can also do virtual transcribe-a-thons, though they are harder. The communication barrier is higher, but a video conference to walk volunteers through the project can be very effective. And it can be very effective, especially with kind of the motivated tech-savvy volunteers you might have with people attending, say, virtual conferences. This was an example that was a transcribe-a-thon held for an online conference for medievalists, in conjunction with the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies. So they had a virtual conference. You have all these medievalists interested in manuscript studies. And as kind of a conference hallway track or back channel, they ran this transcribe-a-thon all during the course of the conference. And at the end, they had transcribed an entire text that they were able to publish.
So you don't have to run a transcribe-a-thon to kick off your project. It's just one way to reach people. But we have other suggestions that we recommend you do something to kick off a project and to do some outreach and some marketing. So what we often tell people is there's kind of these levels of reaching potential volunteers, and your best volunteers are the ones that are associated with your institution, your subject matter, or your location. So that unfortunately relies a lot on you to do the marketing on. Kind of the next level up is kind of geo-targeting our list, looking for transcribers who might overlap with the type of work that you're doing and the volunteers you would be finding on your own, but who've already volunteered on From the Page. And we can help you reach out to those people by looking for people that are maybe within a 50-mile radius of, or your state, or, 50-mile radius of your institution, and, sending them an invitation to help with your project. And then kind of the third level we talk about is, let's put it in our monthly newsletter and mention it to everyone who works on it. And we do it in that way because you don't actually need a ton of volunteers. You just need a handful of really passionate and dedicated volunteers to make great progress. So let's talk about how you can do some of that outreach and marketing. So if you have existing outreach venues like mailing lists, social media accounts, you should definitely use those to push information and mention your project. If you have a physical location, you can do handouts as people walk out the door or at the checkout desk. You can look for subject matter enthusiast communities, people who would be interested in your material but might not be local. You'll find Facebook groups, Twitter accounts, sometimes there's even magazines, and there's actually a blog post that will be in the resources on how to find organizations who might be interested in a particular subject. We also see a lot of local news channels, both print and television, pick up on these projects because they're interesting, they're visual. You have cool old documents, you have people that they can come in and take pictures of, and they're feel-good stories. They're a way for the local community, for retirees to contribute to your mission of preserving memories. So this is coverage by a local TV station of a project by the Seattle Municipal Archives, and Jeannie Fisher is the archivist there. And I just think this is beautiful. You get the old city records in the background, and Jeannie being interviewed on camera about this project that they're doing. When the North Carolina State Archives launched their Colonial Court Records project, they had coverage in 2 large newspapers. It happened to be around the holidays. I think they have a very savvy PR person who knew that holidays are slow news times, and the reporters are always looking for things that they can kind of write in advance and file to have ready to go. And this brought in a lot of interested volunteers. These actually were the highest, these 2 days, these 2 were republished, were the highest number of visits on From the Page's website that year. So it definitely kind of moved the needle in terms of people interested in their project. Once you kick off a project and you're starting to get volunteers working on it, you need to figure out how to keep them engaged. It's not unusual for volunteers to drop by, transcribe a page, and you may never see them again. We have a couple of suggestions for keeping those volunteers engaged. The more you can keep, the more you'll accomplish. So the first one is to welcome new users. We send out a note to project owners every night, telling them what's gone on in their collection the previous day. So you'll get something like the screenshot at the bottom where it shows you the name of someone who joined your particular project. And you can also go into your collaborators tab and see people who joined, and you can grab their email addresses, they've opted in, and you can send them an email. It can be a stock email that tells them what the project is, what the purpose is. Volunteers really like purpose, right? Why are we doing this? And what the transcribed material is going to be used for. If you have any training materials, you can link to that. We also have some kind of stock videos that can help. And you can link to your help tab, your transcription conventions, and you can include how they can contact you. You want them to be able to ask questions or share something that they found, or see if they can bring a group of 20 people in to help you transcribe. And for all of those things, you want them to be able to find you. So make it easy. In addition to welcoming new users, you should respond to questions and comments. So we build this type of social interaction into From the Page, and that nightly email will include those comments and questions from your collaborators. And so you can kind of see over on the right, that's an example from one of these emails. And you should check this every day. There won't always be a lot, but volunteers don't like to feel like their work is going into the void.
Yeah. Yes, there's an example here on the left that I think is really interesting as an example of really effective communication here. A user named Olivia on the Kinehead Lighthouses project is having trouble with the term she's encountering in these lighthouse keepers logs. She said there's a lot of activity around a hack. They're cleaning it, they're painting it, they're varnishing it. What is a hack? And so her leaving that message on a page meant that the next day, the person running the account got that message and was able to respond to it. And they responded immediately. And they said, we don't know what a hack is. And I love this because it is a example of a best practice, because them responding meant that, well, the user Olivia got an email with their response, but she felt listened to. And then the very next day they came back and said, we looked up hack boat. And a hack boat is a small general purpose boat that seems totally practical if you were a lighthouse keeper to have on hand.
So the other thing we recommend is that you include your contact information in your footer. We have a footer that shows up on every page of your project. This particular example is from the LA County Library, and they link to their Facebook and their Twitter and their Instagram, but that questions, contact us, is actually a mail form where you can email them if you have questions. And we really encourage this, because if you don't, transcribers will jump through hoops to try to figure out how to find somebody, and we often get the email, and sometimes it's, I've got related material, would you like it? And sometimes it's a very specific question about how you would like something transcribed, which we can't really answer for you. So and the last thing we recommend is that you send a newsletter. So it doesn't have to be complicated or even that big. Doing something as often as you can, once a month would be lovely. But if it only gets out once a quarter, that's okay. We definitely see people who are like, yeah, we kind of need to re-engage people in this project, so let's send out a newsletter, and maybe it only happens once or twice a year. But anything is better than nothing. And you can pull that list of collaborator emails from your project, and you can paste them into your email client, or if you use something like a newsletter tool, you can pull them in there. And we have some blog posts that have a lot of examples of things that different people will do for crowdsourcing project newsletters. You can do volunteer profiles, you can hit, what are the milestones people hit. The really kind of the key thing is to have a tone to these newsletters, which is, this is so cool and we're so successful and you want to be part of something great, right? Even though it's a small project, it's not necessarily.
You're essentially coaching a team,
yes,
right? And it's a team of volunteers who are all passionate and they all want the project to win.
Right. So that's really all for our formal presentation. If you're interested in kicking the tires or trying out a crowdsourcing project, there's a free trial of up to 200 pages, and we'll have this link in our follow-up email. And you can kind of figure out how FromThePage works and what you can do with it. Ben's going to do a screen share, and we'll make sure that the resources that we mentioned today are linked in the email that we send out. So, yeah.
Usually we stop and do discussion now. So
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So that is our formal presentation. And we'd like to kind of open up the floor for any questions about just kind of general crowdsourcing and the things that we covered, things you think we might have missed. So feel free to raise a hand or add a comment in the chat, or if you like, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself if you have any questions or comments.
Let me scroll through the chat and see if there's anything there. Well, you're welcome to ask questions as we kind of go through and share a little bit as well.
Okay, do institutions ever offer their own laptops for volunteers to come in and use? Yes, and we've also seen institutions offering desktop stations. The Alabama Department of Archives and History has 2 desktops that are dedicated exclusively to their transcription volunteer work. One of the interesting things that they do is that they have those desktops logged in by default to from the page as like ADH volunteer or something, some generic account. So they're not even asking volunteers to create an account on the site. They have very, very low technical barriers to entry there for those on-site users. Now, there are some on-site users who have their own accounts, and so they log out of the shared account and log into their own before they do that work. But it is something that we have seen successfully. It's also something we kind of, recommend if you could for transcribe-a-thons,
Yes.
right? If you already have a computer room, computer stations,
Labs,
holding
yeah.
a transcribe-a-thon there kind of gets people over the hump of bringing their laptop in and trying to connect to your internet and things like that.
All those barriers. Yeah.
Really good question. I think that's the first time we've ever gotten that one. And I should mention that we are hoping to host a webinar on running transcribe-a-thons sometime this year.
I'm working on, so Sonia Coleman, who is with the Library of Virginia, has agreed to participate in a webinar on transcribe-a-thons. And then I want to get a couple of other people who do kind of a big annual transcribe-a-thon to come in and speak, but I haven't confirmed that yet. So that will probably be, August, September, October. We haven't quite narrowed that down yet.
Other questions? Anyone? Shall I jump into a from the page demo then? That it's going to be informal, so people can go back and forth. If you have questions while we're doing that, just let us know. I will do this. Share my screen, and I see somebody else just tried joining, so let me let them in. Okay, so this is an example of a project that we run on from the page. This is one that we run ourselves, and it is a very simple plain text transcription project in the sense that you have narrative text. This is a diary from a tobacco farm before the Civil War, and the system essentially presents the image on one side of the screen and gives us a place on the other side of the screen to type what we see. As people type and hit the save button, we record a new version. So you see the user Fran has come in and she's added this text that shows up in green. I came back in and I corrected a few things, and then she came in and corrected a few more. Then all of that is visible as an activity stream. So every user can see exactly what's going on, and they can modify, they can kind of keep on top of exactly what's happening. This information is also what's sent out to people in their nightly activity report, which is perhaps a good time to switch to Melissa Anderson's question.
Yes. Question, how much staff time does it take to keep a steady stream of material feeding the system and maintaining regular communication with volunteers? I'm going to take the second part first, and then we'll come back to the first one. So once you have a project kind of, ingested and configured, which doesn't take that long, but it just takes a little bit of thinking to get your transcription conventions right and things. I tell people it's less than half an hour a day. So you need to look at that email. You need to welcome new people, which is, do a template email. It's nothing that complicated, and answer any questions. And then on a monthly or less basis or more basis, if you want to send out a newsletter to keep people engaged, that's a great thing to do. And that's going to take you 2 hours, maybe 4 if you do a lot of other marketing ideas. So it's one of these things where if you put a lot into it, it will be more successful. But you can also kind of let it slide if you have other things that are more important at a particular given time. Now, the hope is that it is manageable. Like there are some people who kind of ignore their projects. It's not really recommended because they don't always get done, and kind of take some management to push like that last 15% is actually surprisingly hard to get done, because it just, you need to keep people on point and reminded and help them find what needs to be done to be finished.
And to be fair, a lot of times that last, little bit is because people are encountering material that's not really covered in the instructions. So for example, you've got an entire diary that's been digitized and people have transcribed 365 pages of it that contain narrative. But there's 4 or 5 pages at the end that have like the pre-printed calendar or something that no one touches because they're not sure what to do with that. And that's a case where you as a staff member might just come in and say, done, 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 this is
just
finished.
enough, right? Now, the second half of your question, Melissa, was about, to keep a steady stream of material coming. So I think the first question is stuff digitized already or not? If it is already digitized, then that's great, because it doesn't take that much to get it into the system. And once you've done your first project, then you probably have decent transcription conventions that you only need to tweak for your second and third project. Some people kind of run big projects about once a year or maybe twice a year, and they will take a little break between, and they'll use their collaborator list to kind of announce the new project and try to bring those people back when it's time to do that. So, it's awesome if you want to do what I think of it as projects versus programs. If you want to do a crowdsourcing program, then you have something going all the time and you're always thinking, what's the next project? What's the next project? And you're figuring out how to engage people on it. But you can also think of it as, a project and then another project and then another project. And that kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off.
Yeah, and I will say the only projects that we encounter describing, serious time pressure from the volunteers are ones that launch the project and their plan is to digitize as they transcribe, right? And that means that somebody has to be on both ends of those. And there's one that we've seen at a state archives that's been extremely successful, that has partnered with the Daughters of the American Revolution heritage organization that's providing all these volunteers who all need to record volunteer hours for their chapters.
They're very motivated. They're very competitive.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got, suddenly they go from just your handful of researchers using the digitized material to dozens or hundreds of people spending hours every day working on it. And that requires...
She kind of digitizes and puts stuff up in chunks, and she has trouble keeping up with her volunteers.
Yeah, she puts a chunk up in the morning and then another chunk up in the afternoon.
But one of the cool things about that is we have some review options, and review is not as much fun as transcribing. And review, if you choose to do it with staff time, takes time. You can also choose to do it with designated volunteers, so people that you're experienced and that you trust. So she actually has her volunteers do review as well. So when they run out of things to transcribe, they go review each other's work. So.
Okay, let's jump back into the demo. But that's a great question. And please ask more, everyone, as we go. This is fantastic. So while we wait for another question, and we'll get to yours again, Melissa, here in a minute. We just wanted to talk briefly about other kinds of documents, right? This tobacco plantation diary is narrative, but this document is really not, right? This is a project at the Maryland State Archives that's working with marriage licenses and marriage reports, which are structured data, and they're for people who were married before 1940. And they're asking for essentially, 8 fields. They don't care about the officiant. They don't care about mother's consent or things like that. They don't care about race. They're just looking for the first name, middle name, and last name of the people getting married. So they've configured a form in FromThePage to have people fill out. And then at the end of this project, they'll be exporting this as a spreadsheet that has a row for every image and a column with a cell for each one of these bits of data. Another similar project that people do is, I should mention, we in addition to manuscript transcription, we can also handle OCR correction. But let's talk briefly about, here's a good example. Documents like this, these ledgers, so this is a petition for women's suffrage in Sweden that the Swedish National Archives is running. They have configured this project with some header information that applies to the name of the town and the name of the county, as well as the number of the page. But then they've configured a spreadsheet control that's embedded within each page with columns for each one of the columns in the document itself. And in fact, they're asking people to split out this name column here into first name and last name. Let's jump back into Melissa's question then.
Right. Do you worry about pre-reviewing for potentially sensitive material? So generally people don't do this. There's a lot of projects right now that universities are doing and the state archives are doing that are difficult material. So the Library of Virginia, we mention a lot because they do a lot of projects, but they're working on a project called Virginia Untold. And kind of the point is to, uncover and make accessible information about African Americans in Virginia pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. And a lot of those documents, like one set of their documents they're historically called the Free Negro Registers. Every county, there was a law that was passed, every county had to register all the free Blacks in the county. And so this is not pleasant material, right? This is not as bad as some of them, right? So if you have projects that cover a lot of that, I would do a transcribathon, or more than one even, right? Because we definitely, I think people working together and kind of acknowledging the type of material, and Sonia and Lydia, who run that particular project for Library of Virginia, actually came and spoke at a webinar in February, and you can find that on our YouTube channel if you're curious about how they handle some of that, because it is challenging. We had another case where like a historic house museum outside of Chicago had some material, and they were, transcribers were working on it, and they encountered some offensive language. The people running the project kind of freaked out, like, oh no, we can't show this. And so we coached them through making the project private. So that buys you time, right? You can click of a button and no one can see it. So that's your first kind of thing there. But when you stop and think about it, like I personally think it is more important that people know what language people used and what attitudes people had in the time these documents were written. I don't think we should be hiding that. So maybe what you choose to do is put something in your footer and or your description that says, hey, there might be some offensive language. This reflects the people of the time, and
maybe not us.
Yeah, and not the institution.
Right.
But I think if you're trying to open people's eyes and kind of help them learn true narratives as opposed to maybe what they were taught in school, this is one of the most effective ways to do so. You're not telling them, you're not lecturing them.
And you can explain your purpose doing this, right? I mean, the material that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum hosts, a lot of it is really, really rough, but it's obvious what their purpose is. And we've seen similar projects elsewhere, just grappling with different historical violences or injustices.
Yeah.
Any other questions, or shall I dive back into demo? All right, I'll dive back in, and hopefully people can jump in with other questions.
So the cool thing about this style of transcription Ben has on the screen is when you export it as a spreadsheet with all the header information attached to each record. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So not fun. I'm a technical person. So useful.
So the last kind of activity, and we've talked about transcription and OCR correction. We've talked about indexing. The last activity that we support is something that's fairly new, which is metadata creation after the transcription has happened. So this is a project at Dartmouth University working with a set of papers that they are transcribing and doing a great deal of indexing and annotating on. But after having transcribed them, they are creating item level metadata So they have configured a form similar to the merit certificate form that I showed earlier. But this form asks questions about the item, including, material from all of its pages. And so they have lots of detailed documentation explaining exactly what to do about this. They have a controlled vocabulary for the kinds of documents that they are expecting people to classify things into. And then they have the ability for users to switch between viewing the original documents or viewing, say, in this case, the transcribed text. If this were more than one page, they'd be able to scroll through and see all pages that have been transcribed. Because a lot of times, especially with correspondence, you really need to see the first page and the last page to figure out who something was from and to.
You can also, depending on how you ingest material, your original metadata can come in and you can enhance that or do revision work. I know a lot of institutions are looking for ways to highlight more people that are mentioned in documents, not just the one most important person in it. And so you can upload a spreadsheet of metadata, or it can come in through like IIIF or other kind of formats in order to, and you can see that there's a metadata option here as well, that you can see original metadata and then do this form. Could you find the Indianapolis Public Library Parks project as well?
Oh, yeah,
that is another kind of type of task. So this one that we're going to show you is it's a photo identification project. And so photo identification as a crowdsourced task is kind of challenging because if you just put up a whole bunch of pictures, people are going to be like, oh, that's my grandpa because of the fashion and the facial hair and things like that. Things like they're going to pattern match on things that are kind of not actually their grandpa, probably just sort of looks like their grandpa. But if you can, have a set of photographs that are very scoped. So this particular one, that's interesting, is from their Parks and Recreation department. So all of a sudden, there's another subset of this that I guess they've taken down or is not active anymore, which is unidentified park pictures. It's like, we got pictures of parks.
Well, that's what this one is.
Okay.
Only this one is not of an actual park. So someone has said, hey, this is not a park. So normally they're saying, which park is it? And why do you think so? In this case, someone has said, well, it's not a park, but here's where I found a photo on Google Map, and I checked the
hit the
text.
maybe we can read all that easier.
Yeah, this is.
There we go.
Yeah, so they're saying, which park is this? And please explain why you think so. And this is the kind of thing that we see really dedicated volunteers doing. They're doing additional resources, the research. This person says the house number is 1750. The sign says West Side Enterprise. And then they went off and looked up 1750 on Google Maps and looked around to try to find these. Then they went into the tax assessor's records, looked up who owned these. I mean, this is just kind of incredible that they searched on a family tree website. We know so much more about this photo than probably anyone in the staff would, just because this one user went the extra
did a
mile.
bunch of research.
Yeah.
And associated it with the closest park,
Yes.
which is what, this is a parks collection of photos. So if you can scope things down, you can do interesting photo identification. We also see some really fun projects. Ohio University is doing one with dance posters, and it's a private project, and they've invited alumni of their dance program in to help them describe the posters, but the alumni were probably in some of the performances, definitely know the choreographers, know a lot about what was happening. So it's a really interesting project. Alt text. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to answer Janet's question, and then Melissa will come back to the question about alt text, because I have an even better example than what we just showed. Are there Janet Evans asks, are there authoritative standards for transcription?
Yes, a lot of them.
Way more than you want to think about.
Yes, and that's kind of unfortunate. So there are standards that have existed for printed transcriptions and documentary editions. We like recommending the Guide to Documentary Editing by Klein and Purdue. And then there's also Stevens and Berg's, there's a guideline for editing historic documents is their book. there are entirely separate online only digital forms of transcribing them, like the guidelines created by the Text Encoding Initiative, the TEI guidelines, are spectacular. They've thought through almost every nuance of what you might encounter dealing with text. The question, though, is what use are you going to be putting the transcripts to? Because if you are going to be using them, say, just for full text search in a database that doesn't support complicated markup, well, it's an awful shame to ask people to add all these tags to do this markup that you then have to throw away, right? Or that your database still can't deal with, right? So it really depends on the research purpose, on the findability purpose, on the reason for the project, as well as on the material itself. We are happy to jump on one-on-one calls to do a deep dive on people's materials and talk through project ideas and talk about transcription conventions. I mean, that's obviously I'm pretty keen on it.
Right. There's a lot more that you can do than we've even shown you, but it, like all software, it gets more complicated the more you dig into it.
You were asking me to look up another.
In my account, there's an alt text example. So
I've got one too. So
you do. Okay. So we actually have. So Melissa said that's a really interesting idea to get more information about photo metadata for alt text too. Yeah, there we go. That's it. We actually created with some collaboration with University of North Carolina was thinking about this. And a field that we actually call an alt text field. It's just a text field, but it does two things. You notice that count at the bottom underneath the text field, it tells you how many characters you've typed. And as you type this and you start hitting the limits for alt text, then we'll very soon hopefully hit there. Let's keep going. All right, about it starts changing color when you hit, I guess it was 130 or so, it changes colors and it kind of gets hotter as you get closer to the end, and then we cut you off when you hit the max. And then you can add like this instructions field at the top. You could put whatever you want there.
Right. And so you can explain to people a little bit better what you're looking for, what good alt text is. And then this is all exportable as spreadsheets so that you could attach it to the images in your digital asset management system. Yeah. We're pretty excited about this one too.
Yeah, Janet, for your purposes, when we think about standards for transcription, I was also going to say, I believe you're with a botanical horticultural library. A lot of those projects like to mark up species names. And
for research purposes, other sets of the projects are working with the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which we integrate directly with. They are an example of an organization that cannot accept any extra markup besides plain text. So they need just verbatim text with nothing else.
Yeah.
But
you can also do two different exports. You can do a plain text export into something like that, and you can do Word or PDF or HTML or TEI out with more marked up text.
You can pull a spreadsheet export of every species that's been mentioned within your documents, for example, as well as feeding the plain text to the Biodiversity Heritage Library.
Yeah, BHL does its own tagging for species.
Yes.
And we've had discussions with them for
years at this point, but
yeah,
we've had
new ones.
Yes, we've had new ones for the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
Do you want to show any at the back end? I don't know, okay. We can. Pulling material in is super simple. If you have a DAMS that supports IIIF or you use Content DM, you can just paste in a URL to the item or the collection. You can upload zip files of images, zip files of images, zip files of PDFs, just PDFs, and we'll pull the images out of those. So we try to support a lot of different ways to get your material in. We similarly have many, many different ways to get your material out.
You can pull material out as HTML or plain text. You can pull it out as spreadsheets. PDF files, Microsoft Word files, there's really no shortage of ways to pull things out. We even have the ability to integrate with some text analysis tools like Voyant to send your text directly over to that. So you can see the Graves variety, what does it mention most? And unsurprisingly, for a Virginia tobacco plantation, it mentions tobacco.
So lots of different things.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're
About
done.
All right.
Any other questions or anything else we can?
Thank you all for attending. We are always happy to jump on a call.
Yeah.
Or to swap a few emails chatting about project ideas.
Right. We do have a webinar coming up at the end of the month. We've started doing a lot more experimenting with ChatGPT and the GPT models. So I know some of you ended up here because you were at our first ChatGPT webinar, which was a lot of fun. So we're doing another one at the end of the month if you'd like to join us for that.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.